Hello everyone, it's great to be there with you, albeit in this digital format. Would have loved to be there, of course, in person, but not this time. Would have liked to see some of the familiar faces and go out for a beer afterwards, but that'll have to wait, hopefully next year if I get invited again. And so just quickly, Design Partnership opened an office here in Australia about 8 years ago. When we researched and did all of our recce trips here to see whether this was a viable proposition, we thought that things were kind of similar, if not the same. On the surface, in fact, it seemed to be, but we couldn't have been further from the truth. It is completely different. People behave completely different. The mannerisms, the way that they kind of communicate. In South Africa, you would know when you kind of off the off brief or not hitting the brief. People are quite direct. Over here, it's not so direct, and so that was the one part. And also the fact that the red tape here is phenomenal. It's actually quite scary, the amount of red tape, and people are all covering their bases and making sure that they're not putting themselves or the clients at risk. And so we spend a tremendous amount of time just looking at the BCA Building Code of Australia. And that meant that we were, in essence, in the kind of total package or timeline, very restricted in terms of the time that we had left over to design. Also the fact that we get called in late after all the negotiations have been completed, and finally the go-ahead is given, and it's already a couple of weeks, if not months, into the final project. So we needed to find, first of all, something that we could lift our flag to, something that we could hoist our flag to, something that we could stand for. And so, being everything to everyone would mean that we take a tremendous amount of time to cut through the clutter. And so we decided to frame the idea of a restaurant design as a focus and as a category to be best in class in. And then we also said that we needed to be something more than just interior architects, which is what we do mainly, although we just started doing some buildings. We needed to call it out a bit more in a differentiated way, and that's where we developed this kind of catchphrase, design for behavior. So this philosophy on design for behavior originated really as an idea in South Africa when we spoke quite frequently on the way people behave quite irrationally, but also quite predictably, as per the book by Dan Ariely, Predictably Irrational. Now, he's written a lot of books, similar books, but it really boils down to the idea that our behavior in many ways it's kind of almost preset. We do things in a very much in an automated manner by triggers, external triggers and internal triggers and triggers within space. And so because of the time that we had, or the lack of time really that we had, this became something that we researched in quite a lot of depth. And I'll explain this maybe more effectively by the telling of three stories. I'll take you through three stories quite briefly, and then take you to some work that expresses this kind of philosophy. And the first one is the story of Salvador Asail and the Black Pearls. Now, Salvador returned from the war in 1945, eager to join his dad's successful business selling waterproof Swiss watches to the American troops. But to his dismay, he found that the end of the war also brought an end to the demand for these watches. So in a desperate attempt to get rid of containers full, he goes to Japan, where there are still some American troops stationed, but they too are not interested in the watches. And as at the moment where he thought that all is lost, he finds that the Japanese, in fact, love his watches and are willing to trade their white Akoya pearls. He would have preferred money, but at the end of the war, of course, nobody had currency, and pearls were the only option really at the time. And so he starts trading the watches for pearls, and it takes him a few years, but eventually he's able to trade all of the watches for the most beautiful stock of pre-war white Acquoia pearls. And so he starts trading in pearls, and he becomes so successful that quite soon after that, he is known as the Pearl King. And with the wind now firmly at his back, he starts traveling further and wider and in search of bigger and better pearls, when quite accidentally, he stumbles upon black Tahitian pearls. Now, whilst these pearls are quite beautiful, they are junk pearls because nobody's seen them and therefore nobody wants them. Anyway, so he calls upon his friend Harry Winston. He has a store in Fifth Avenue in New York, and he, together with Harry, decide to display a string of these pearls in his store window on Fifth Avenue, and they do so against a backdrop of the most expensive rubies and diamonds. And they have a go. They put $1 million price tag on the string of pearls, and it sells within 2 weeks. How could something almost, or something of no value, junk pearls really, suddenly move from junk to $1 million? What happened? Well, the answer lies in a very strong human bias called anchoring. And with a lack of information on a certain topic or subject or matter, we default to the thing that is closest to it as reference points, the anchor. And then we jump to conclusions about the thing that we don't know, and we do so almost immediately. And so what does this tell us about people? Well, it tells us that we have a lot of heuristics, biases, mental shortcuts, mistakes in our thinking really, and that these are the things that we need to design for if we want to design beautiful human-centered spaces that back into how we actually behave most of the time. Let's lead to story 2. Where do these shortcuts and biases and mistaken our thinking, where does it come from? Well, to get to that answer, we need to dial back 250,000 years ago to when our Homo sapien forefathers descended or lived on the savanna plains and walked quite successfully on their hind legs and started really playing around with tools and free hands, developing better and better tools. And this ability to walk on their hind legs and use tools allowed them to see further. It also allowed them to walk further. It allowed them to hunt better. And with these new skills, they started traveling further and further north up through Africa, eventually landing themselves in South Asia and Europe and so forth. But this migration through the various territories brought new challenges, new climates, new animals, all kinds of new challenges. And this forced their hardwiring to develop, forced them to get more intelligence and to develop more and more skills. And so around 50,000 years ago, with this push of requirement to develop better skills, most probably for hunting, because that was survival, language develops. About 30,000 years ago, there's proof of the burying of dead and religion and the discovery of art. And then around 10,000 years ago, we see that agriculture is discovered, and that's where people settle down. They stop migrating so much. They start living in larger communities and kind of families, if you will. But it's also around 10,000 years ago that we see that there are no more mass eruptions of volcanoes or mass melting of glaciers, and therefore there are no external pressures that force people to develop further. And so evolutionary psychologists will argue that although the world has developed dramatically since then, our hardwiring has in fact not, by all accounts that matter. There's also this kind of saying, therefore, that you can take the person out of the Stone Age, but not the Stone Age out of the person. or you can add to this maybe one or two more arguments. If you think about the built environment around us, in terms of the evolution and the line of evolution, really only been around and pervasive for the last 3 or 4% of our development. For the rest, we've been in nature. The built environments we're really only starting to understand the impact of the built environment on us as people, and therefore a stronger voice around this idea of form follows feeling as opposed to function. And that has gained a tremendous amount of inertia of late. And then think about also the fact that everything that you know, everything that's around us, cars, trains, planes, automobiles, your personal computer, every reference that you have, in fact, has really been pervasive for the last 100 years. And so this starts to explain this incredible disconnect that you really have in our hardwiring to the kind of world that we have around us today. So then this leads us to story 3, really what this talk is about, design for behavior. How people think they will behave and say they will behave, and how they actually behave is severely disconnected. Our evolutionary hardwiring dictates, as pointed out in the story of our development, that we have all kinds of mental shortcuts and heuristics, defaults in our thinking. And this causes us to behave in all kinds of irrational manners that has no logic often. And so we design spaces and places with knowledge, and it's often the curse of knowledge, because it seems correct by all accounts by how people should behave, but how people should behave and behave are not aligned. So sometimes, in fact, we need to design wrong to be right. And so with that knowledge, then how do we design responsibly? Well, the answer lies really in finding, collecting, and banking these behaviors and our responses to certain exact architectural typologies, because it then gives us answers to the specific behaviors. We can actually design for those things almost as a toolkit. And so you find more and more neuroscientists are teaming up with architects and designers to understand through neuroimaging, sweat sensors, eye tracking software, and so forth, what our exact responses are to these environments. So on the last topic, it was a nice segue into this idea of our association with color. I've certainly been taught, and I've made the mistake of teaching that as well, that we have a very specific association with color, specifically in interiors, and that there are certain appetite enhancers and certain appetite suppressants in the kind of color rainbow. But there's a bit of a twist to all of this, and so let me go and collect the story at the beginning. So through our evolutionary development, we've developed certain associations with food color, and you can see that in the way meat, for example, is marketed and presented. It's, meat would be gray if it's packaged, but it's enhanced so to look red, because that makes it look fresher, and also we believe it's tastier and so forth. And the same is done with apples and a variety of foods. The color is changed so that we just feel more attracted to that product. And so there's a famous study done in the 70s where a bunch of people were put in a room and given steak and chips to eat. And the light, in fact, was manipulated through the process of observing these subjects. People enjoyed the food, everything was hunky-dory, and then suddenly the way the lights enhanced the food was switched off, and the real color of the products were on display. The meat was in fact blue, and the chips was green, and people got sick. They all stopped eating, and some got physically sick. So that, and there are many of these kind of studies around our association with color, specifically in food. And so by extension, therefore, a lot of architects, designers, and teachers made the jump that these colors also affect the way that we perceive a space, a hospitality space. And so blue, it's always been said to be in a restaurant, to be in a bar rather, but if it's in a restaurant, it needs to be a seafood restaurant. And so there are all these associations. Now, we've taken months to study this and read up on this, scientific papers, and every single article written around this idea of these colors affecting our appetite and our mood within space references only other articles that's making the same claim. None of them reference any scientific papers. And so the science behind it is completely different. In fact, with studies done where people were given food within certain background colors, dividing the room or the people in two, the half that were told of the impact of these colors on appetite corresponded with the theory. The half that were not told did not correspond with the theory. So to make this interesting, let's talk a bit about some of these irrational behaviors that make no sense, but we do them all the time. So the first thing is, why do we go to restaurants? You would argue that we go for the food. It turns out that this is actually not true, because if it was in fact for the food, we would simply order in. We go to socialize. What attracts most people to places, restaurants, are in fact other people. And you can test this, and I'm sure you've done this by walking past the restaurants or a couple of restaurants. Call it just two restaurants for the sake of this conversation. The one is very busy and it runs a queue, and the other one is kind of empty with no queue. And what do? You join the queue because other people have decided already, and you think that they know there's something that you don't, and that is called herding. And you don't join the one that is got no people because it doesn't have the social proof of a queue. And then there's also something called self-herding, and that's when you've gone to a restaurant, you stood in a line, you've gone inside. In the follow-up experiences, even though there may not be a queue, you will queue mentally behind yourself and go to the same restaurant. And then there's, of course, this idea of the perception of food. We think we remember taste, but do we really? So an experiment done by the University of Haifa, they found a direct link between the taste cortex and the hippocampus. The hippocampus, of course, the area of our brain responsible to code and store memory. And they found if the experience in the restaurant was great, the food would be remembered. But if it's not, the food is not. And so there's an argument to be had for this idea that we don't actually remember taste. And that taste, the idea of taste, is linked to our social experience. And then by extension, because you spoke earlier about people and that we're drawn to people first and foremost, that the link, therefore, to people is most important. And so you can try this for yourself. Think about your best food memory. And the chances are that you will say, it was a time I went with, and whoever those people may be. It will never just be about an isolated food item. So I just want to talk briefly about 3 projects that's interesting for this conversation. That's like any practice, you have projects that are not interesting for a talk like this. And the first one is 1788, and that's in Dubai, right opposite the Burj Khalifa. Obviously, the highest tower in the world. And this is sitting at the foot of it, and it kind of has this beautiful view. And people book out and they pay a fortune over New Year to see the light that they project on it. It's a bit like in Australia where they have the kind of fireworks on the bridge. And so we developed something that 1788 was when the first fleet came to Australia. And that reference is Six Head. And I think we've spoken about that before. The name is Six Head in Australia, the name of the restaurant. And where it comes from is when the first fleet left England. It came via the Cape of Good Hope. It picked up a bunch of cattle. Some died along the way. Finally, they arrived in Botany Bay. 6 cattle that survived, and they were then put in a pen. And one day during lunch, kind of in the beginning of it all, they got away. They were rediscovered 10 years later. They'd multiplied to 100, which saved the colony from starvation. So it's called 6 head over here, but we couldn't use 6 head in the Middle East because, that's where people are still beheaded. So we changed the name to the date 1788, but we needed to find a new theme, and we scripted the story around flax seeds, which was the other thing that they brought over. And the flax seeds were used to spice food and also make sheets, bed sheets, and clothing. And so it was a very important product for the fleet and for their survival here. So we developed this flower that sits in the middle that you can see there, that is an expression with a lot of license of the flower of a flaxseed, and that is the heart of the design. It's quite large, and it holds a mezzanine, and that's the mezzanine where the guys will pay a couple of $1,000s per person on New Year just to sit there in this big round table and have the primary seats and observe the lights. And then we have the kind of half round seating around the perimeter and the bottom, and the entire thing is laid out in that kind of principle of a flower. And then we have this petal sitting over the top of it, kind of to hold it. Now all of it, as you can see, quite flashy and quite bright and gilded, but it's the kind of thing that culturally fits that area. So first of all, a lot of focus on green and plants because there's desert and there's loved that idea. And so biophilia is important. And then secondly, this kind of almost, I think we stopped right just short of it being a bit too brash. It'd be good to get any of your views on this afterwards, perhaps. Welcome to mail me. The second one is Bly Street. Now Bly Street is interesting because the bulk of the seating is actually outside, but there's a 21-meter high concrete ceiling above it. So the idea was, Bly Street, the client is South African, and he wanted the idea of African safari. And so you see this in this expression, what we did to kind of reduce the ceiling height is we have these massive oversized thorn trees, and then we have these kind of huts that sit around the perimeter of it, these pods that people can sit in. And what we've done, or what we're busy doing, and they're building the prototype for us now, is that each hut inside on the bench sheet has a thermostat, so you can set the heat within each seat to your liking. And then we have a real fire that sits in the heart of it, with this kind of seating around it, and then kind of the king's hut in the corner, the big round one that would be. Now all of these areas, of course, especially those kind of the king's hut as a private dining room, there's quite a few there people pay a premium for just to go and sit there. Those things will be packed permanently. How do you do this though? If you go to a safari, there's something quite different about a safari. You have the smell when the rain has just hit the soil, and that sound of the first rains, and the smell when it stops, or when a lion roars, that distant roaring with the echo, the light as it kind of settles through the all the dust, and it's those oranges, the smell of fire. And so how do we do that? We can't obviously mimic that, but we have to kind of find ways to transcend some of those emotions. So it's done in part by these things that I just explained, but also we are in the fire, because we can't in the city have real fire. It's not allowed, it's gas fire, but we find these embers that we will sprinkle, what they will do during service, they'll give you that smell of doringhout burning, which is a phenomenal thing, and smell is such a phenomenal thing to take you to places. And then the materiality of all the products, the huts are done in a framework, and then we'll be using clay to cover the top, mixed with horsehair, so they have a lot of that original kind of feel, and that also comes with, you know, some smells. What you experience when you hear all the senses kind of being engaged. In addition, and it sounds a little bit quirky perhaps, but you know, nobody expects a lion to be in the middle of the city, so we're not going to have roaring lion sounds, but what we will have is the kind of the chirping of birds, because that is expected. We may just, and that is, you know, biomimicry does a tremendous amount for your senses. So we'll experiment with those bird sounds that'll play over a separate set of speakers to see what is taking it far enough and what's taking it kind of just too far. And then the last one is Castlereagh. The challenge here was that it's a site with no windows. We have no windows. It used to be a bank, and so that explains it. So we needed to convert a bank site to a very sought after restaurant space. And so we leaned into the fact that it had no windows, and we made it quite special. We made it quite dark, made it kind of glow and almost kind of fold around you as a safe place. And so you can see it in the way that the lighting was used around the perimeter, the horseshoe bench seating that sits on the one side and the straight on the other. And then in the center, and we had this made by good friends of ours in Cape Town, these sculpture pieces, and they're quite phenomenal. The impact on site is incredible, because it's unusual here to see something like that. And I guess that's some of the advantage that we have in coming from Africa and coming from a place like Pretoria as well, where we were kind of exposed to all of this. And there's a beauty in this kind of rawness. And we are very happy to be here and be able to bring a bit of Africa to Australia. And I think hopefully there were some learnings in this talk. I'd love to engage with everyone if there was a way after, and I hope to be there next year in person to speak if I'm invited back, and hope the rest of the event is fantastic. Thank you.